Hi everybody, and welcome to the module on the theory of island biogeography. In addition to this lecture, this particular module has its own homework assigned to it. It's in the same module packet on Canvas as this lecture itself and the slides, so make sure you work through that and keep an eye on the deadline. Okay, today we're going to be talking about the theory of island biogeography by McCarthy and Wilson. This theory was first put forward in the 60s, and it's one of the classic theories in ecology. It's not perfect, but it does do a very good job of explaining some principles. Okay, so let's start sharing the screen. Where's the one I'm after? Okay. So in today's class, by the end of it, you should be able to employ the theory of island biogeography, describe how species diversity changes with island size and distance to a mainland, and apply these concepts to islands that are not islands. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, oh, I'll just set my pointer up as well. So last week, we talked about the processes that determine species richness generally. And we talked about these four principles. So immigration and emigration, speciation and extinction. And we talked about how these can affect species richness in evolutionary and ecological time. And we talked about how two of them, which are immigration and speciation, increase species richness, and emigration and extinction reduce species richness. And today, a lot of what we're talking about is going to focus on these two. So we're looking at immigration and extinction. And we're looking at a very particular way in which these two can affect the species richness in a particular location. So let's say, to start off with, let's just say a new island forms from the top of a volcano in the ocean. So an awful lot of the world's volcanoes are actually underwater. They're in the ocean. The water and the oceans cover a lot more of the surface of the planet than the land does. So just by sheer chance, we'd expect a lot of volcanoes to be in the ocean. So say, for example, we have this situation where this volcano is erupting and erupting and erupting, and eventually it gets so big that the top of it goes through the surface of the ocean, and we get a new island. And this isn't just an abstract concept. This does actually happen a fair bit. I've got a video of it here. Just let me sort it out. Pointer options. Okay. I just need to new share. Let's go on to, where did I have it? Here we go. So here is a new island forming.
This footage from Japan's Coast Guard catches the moment a new island is born. The eruption of an underwater volcano in the Ogasawara island chain allowed the new land to burst from the water amidst a plume of ash 600 meters high. The 200-meter diameter island joins an estimated 6,000 islands within Japan's territory, and if it survives its eruptions, it will technically become part of Tokyo, despite being over 1,000 kilometers to the south. Japanese media reported that the last time an island was formed in the region was in 1973 and 4, as the nearby Nishinoshima was created. Officials have said that it is too early to start naming this island, though, as there have been instances in the past when newly formed islands have sunk back into the waves.
So I just wanted to show you this is not a sort of rare occurrence, to the extent it happens so often it's even been videoed. And if we look all across the world, we see a lot of these volcanic islands. So for example, one that you might be familiar with is Hawaii. So all the islands of Hawaii are a series of volcanic islands that have risen out of a crack in the two plates that sit within the middle of the Pacific. That's why they sit on this nice line. In addition, the Galapagos Islands, one of the most famous volcanic islands in the world. This is a series of islands off the coast of Ecuador, all of which were formed by volcanoes. And what's nice about these is, just like Hawaii, you can actually see the high points, which are the volcanoes that formed the islands. This is not just a tropical thing as well. We see it in a lot of other locations. So for example, this is Iceland. Iceland has got a whole series of volcanoes. It's affectionately known as the land of fire and ice. And the one thing I love about this picture is I would really be interested to know what's going on with the real estate values in these houses right now, because that's a volcano which has obviously been active at times. There's one coming off right here. Like, you can't say you weren't warned. But these volcanic islands are appearing an awful lot of the time. So we start asking the question, well, in ecological time, so 1 to 10 generations, what determines species richness on a new island? After this island is formed, what determines how many species are present on it? Well, this was the inspiration for this ecological theory by MacArthur and Wilson called the theory of island biogeography. By biogeography, we think about what is the biology in a location. Bio, biology, geography, place. Okay? And they came up with this theory that's now being applied to a whole series of different situations. And this is what the whole theory looks like. It is a graphical, logical model. I've got it all up here, and then we're going to go through it in pieces slowly. Because last week, we talked about immigration, colonization, and extinction as determinants of species richness at a given location. So let's have a look at this graph briefly. So remember how we approach graphs. First thing, what sort of graph is it? Well, it's got lines on it, so it looks like a line graph. Second, what are the axes? Well, on the x-axis, we've got S, which stands for species richness in this case. And on the y-axis, we have rates of immigration and extinction. So what are we looking at? We're looking at how a level of species richness, how many species there are, affects immigration in the green and extinction in the red. This is the whole model just here. So MacArthur and Wilson came up with this model in the 1960s. And although it is a very simplified representation of what actually goes on in the real world, it has been shown to be useful and is still used to this day. What it does is it shows the rates of immigration and extinction as functions of species richness. What's important on this model is that time is not explicitly graphed. It is not including time. So you need to sort of make sure you're aware of that. Okay. So let's go through these functions one at a time. So why do the rates follow these slopes or straight lines, but the same slopes? So let's think first about extinction. So on the x-axis, we have our rates of species richness going from low species richness to high. And on the y-axis, we're focusing on the red, which in this case, this line represents extinction. Because when species richness is very small, we've got an awful lot of resources available because there is very low competition. We've got a low number of species, and so as a result, there's relatively little competition. Also, because we've got low numbers of species, just mathematically and by chance, if we have few species, we might also have few predators, which means prey species are not likely to get overexploited to extinction. As species richness increases, however, resources are used up and the number of predator species on the island increases. This increased competition and increased predation reduces the densities of species. It reduces the number of individuals in each species. And when S is very high, any disturbance, stroke shortage, can wipe out low density species. So when species richness is very high, it means we've got lots of competition, lots of predation, and that means that a lot of species will end up going extinct because they get outcompeted or their prey species that get overexploited by their predators. So what we have is a very low species richness, we have low competition and low predation. High species richness, we have high competition, high predation. So at high species richness, we get higher levels of extinction than at low species richness. Okay. Now if we go through immigration, so on the same graph, but now we're looking at the green line, so the immigration rate. What's going on with that? Well, when species richness is very small, any new individual that happens by chance to land on our island is likely to be a new species. So it means that when you've got a very low number of species, the chance of any new individual that arrives in being a new species is quite high. So this means we have a high colonization rate. However, the source area where these species are coming from contains a limited number of species that are capable of reaching the island. And because we have this limited number of species from the source, as species richness goes up on our island, newly arriving species from our source are likely to be from a species that's already present on the island. So at high species richness, any new individual that arrives from the source population, source community, the chances are it's a member of a species that's already present on the island. So colonization rate doesn't colonize, is already there. As a result, at high species richness, the colonization rate tails off to 0. And what we have in the middle, where these two lines cross, is our equilibrium point, SEQ, so species equilibrium point. And we might think about, well, why is this crossover an equilibrium point? Well, we can work it through. When we're in this portion of the graph, so when our species richness is up here, at this section, extinction rates in the red are higher than immigration rates in the green. And because extinction, the loss of species, is higher than immigration, the arrival of species richness will be pushed down to here because more species are going extinct than are arriving. In this section of the graph, when species richness is quite low, immigration rates are higher than extinction rates. What this means is because new species are arriving faster than species that are there going extinct, species richness increases and it pushes it back into this point. Okay. So what we essentially have is, let's work through a scenario. So let's say, for example, a disturbance drops species richness below the equilibrium point. So we're on a new island, which is, in this case, a volcanic island. If it's a volcanic island, chances are it's going to have a volcanic eruption. That represents a disturbance. That volcanic eruption, by chance, will just drive some species to extinction. This extinction of species reduces competition and predation. That then reduces extinction rates and increases immigration. The extra, say for example, on the flip side, extra species arrive, increasing species richness above our equilibrium point. Well, that will increase competition and predation, which will raise the likelihood that species will go extinct. So the nice thing about the theory of island biogeography is it's got this equilibrium point and these two processes that maintain the species richness at this equilibrium point. So we might think about what are the physical characteristics of an island. Not all islands are exactly the same. What are the physical characteristics of an island and how do they change these immigration and extinction rates? Well, the island area, so the size of an island, influences mainly extinction rates. Extinction rates are higher on small islands because there's fewer resources to go around, so there's higher competition. And extinction rates are lower on large islands. What this does is it moves the equilibrium point to the left or right. So say in this graph, this solid red line is our original island. If we go to a smaller island, the extinction rates are higher for a given species richness just because competition is higher. So a smaller island, this dashed line now represents the extinction rate. Because this dashed line is increasing more rapidly, it crosses the green line further to the left on the x-axis. So our equilibrium point has now changed. Remember, our equilibrium point is the point where the green and the red lines cross. So a smaller island, the increased extinction rates move the equilibrium point from here to here. And we have a lower number of species at our equilibrium point. On a larger island, because there's more resources available, there's less competition. That means we have generally lower rates of extinction for a given species richness. These lower rates of extinction mean that the red line crosses the green line further to the right here. And that moves our species equilibrium point from here to here, which means on larger islands, we actually have more species because we've got lower extinction rates. Conversely, isolation distance, or the distance that an island is from the mainland, influences mainly immigration rates. because closer islands have higher immigration rates, just because it's easier to cross a small piece of ocean than a big piece, and distant ones have lower immigration rates. This, again, moves our equilibrium point to the left or the right. So this green line number represents our original island. If we're looking at a distant island, in this case, the dashed line, in a distant island, the immigration rates are lower than they are for our initial island. These lower immigration rates mean that the immigration line crosses the extinction line further to the left. That then reduces our equilibrium point to here. Conversely, if it's a nearby island, rates of immigration are higher than for our initial island, so they're higher here. Higher than our initial island because there's less ocean to cross. These higher rates of immigration mean that we cross the extinction line further to the left on the species richness line. This moves our equilibrium point from here to here, and we end up with a higher level, a higher value for our species equilibrium point. Okay, so given that, let's just do a quick fake clicker question. So which island would you expect to exhibit the largest equilibrium value of S? A small island near its continental source. B, a large island far away from its source. C, a small island far away from its source. Or D, a large island near its source. Just give you 5 seconds on this one. 3, 2, 1, go. Okay. Well, we would expect a large island near its source to have the largest equilibrium value for S. The reason this is a large island is going to have low rates of extinction, which reduce species, which means you've got higher species richness, and a nearby island have higher rates of immigration, which again increase species richness. So generally, in this case, we're talking about richness is a function of island size and distance from the mainland. Small islands have less habitat, they have smaller populations, and this causes higher rates of extinction through predation and intra or inter-specific competition. Intra-specific competition is competition for resources among individuals of the same species. So for example, 2 squirrels competing over nuts. Inter-specific competition describes competition over a resource by 2 different species. So for example, a squirrel and a bird competing over nuts. When it comes to distance from the mainland, distant islands have lower rates of colonization. However, this does depend on the dispersal mechanism of the species, and we'll talk about this a bit later. Now, the theory of island biogeography that was put forward by McCarthy and Wilson, when they first put it forward, they just did it as a sort of logical thought exercise. They thought about these guiding principles that would affect species richness on an island with all other factors being equal, and they just drew up these graphs and explained it. However, it was very quickly demonstrated in different systems. So for example, when we look at the equilibrium theory of biogeography, this equilibrium model may explain the common observation that species richness decreases with distance from the mainland. So this map and this figure are both taken from a paper by Jared Diamond in 1972. So remember, the theory of island biogeography was developed in 1967. So 5 years later, this very elegant example of it happening in real life was shown. So Jared Diamond nowadays is a popular science author. He's written an awful lot of very sort of New York Times bestseller books, including Collapse, which is talking about the falling apart of civilization. Third Chimpanzee was one of his big ones, and also The World Until Yesterday, which is really kind of cool. I can recommend them highly if anyone wants to read them. But this was work that Jared did. He started off as an ornithologist, so someone that studies birds, and he then moved on to sort of human geography and things like that. But this is part of his PhD work. For his PhD, he was lucky enough to travel to Papua New Guinea in the early 1970s. In the early 1970s, this was a very, very unexplored part of the world. Here we're down in the South Pacific Ocean. This is the northern tip of Australia. And Papua New Guinea sits just above the northern tip of Australia. Papua New Guinea is a nation. It's got this large mainland and then this whole series of islands that come out from it. So it's a wonderful opportunity to test the theory of island biogeography, especially because Papua New Guinea is home to a very charismatic group of birds called the birds of paradise. And so these are very unique and iconic species, and they're very easy to identify at a distance. So what Jared Diamond did was he calculated the number of different bird species. He visited these islands and tallied up the number of species on that island, on those different islands. And he produced this figure. So remember, when we're reading graphs, what do we do first? Well, we look at it and say, well, it's a line graph stroke scatter plot. We look at the axes. On the x-axis, we have distance in kilometers. And on the y-axis, we have actual species richness divided by near island species richness. So what Jared Diamond did was he counted the number of birds on each island and divided the number of birds on each island by the number of birds on the nearest island. So each of these islands, the species richness is represented as a proportion of the number of species on the nearest island. And what did he show? Well, as you increase distance in kilometers from the mainland, you have this really rather rapid decrease in the number of bird species you see on the island. So increased distance, a nice linear decline in number of bird species. What do we look at when we see this relationship? Well, it's quite a steep relationship, and also it's a very tight relationship. The points are neatly clustered around the line of best fit. So it was a very good example demonstrating the theory of island biogeography applied when it came to distance from the mainland. The same principle was shown again a little bit closer to home. So this is figures taken from a paper by Simbaloff and Wilson's experiment on mangrove islands in the Florida Keys. They conducted this experiment that you would never get away with nowadays. So what they did was they went to these islands in the Florida Keys and they cut down all the trees and removed all the plants off the island. They literally, what they call, defaunated them. So killed everything on them, basically. What they then did was they revisited these islands multiple times after they'd basically killed them, and then counted the number of species now present on the island. And what we can see is each of these is the rate of growth, but if we look at sort of day 350, the number of species at day 350 was much lower on faraway islands than it was on nearby islands. So again, demonstrating the same principle that the nearer an island is to the mainland, the more species it has on it. So again, demonstrating part of the theory of island biogeography. Okay, so this was applied at first, and the theory was first conceived and applied to islands in the ocean. But we might think about, well, when is an island not an island? So all an island really means is it's an island is an area of habitat surrounded by non-habitat that species can't easily cross. For us personally, when we think about an island, we immediately think of, oh, island in the ocean. This is because land to us is habitat. Ocean is not habitat, although we can swim and dive and sail and things like that. We can't actually live in the ocean. So ocean represents non-habitat. Land represents habitat. So for us, an island is a piece of habitat, the land, surrounded by non-habitat. But that's not true for all species. So for example, there are other islands, depending on what species you're talking about. For example, Bear Lake could easily be considered an island from the perspective of trout or cisco or any other fish species. Bear Lake, if you're a fish, is an area of habitat surrounded by a lot of non-habitat that a species can't easily cross. If you're a lake trout in Bear Lake, you cannot cross these mountain ranges easily. Therefore, this is an island of habitat surrounded by non-habitat. Okay. Also, there are many species of what we call alpine species. These are species that are adapted to live at high altitudes on the top of mountains. Although they can live in the harsh conditions at the top of mountains, they often cannot compete with other species that are better competitors and live in the valleys. So as a result, if you're an alpine species, the tops of mountains represent islands of habitat surrounded by these valleys, which represent impenetrable non-habitat. So in many cases, islands are not what we would think of as classic islands. They're things like lakes and mountaintops and things like that. But the theory of island biogeography can be applied to these different types of islands in exactly the same way as it can to islands of land in the ocean. Okay, so we've talked here about the theory of island biogeography, and we've talked about how the rates of immigration and extinction are affected by what we call the abiotic conditions of the island. By abiotic conditions, we mean how big the island is and how far away it is from the mainland. But in the theory of island biogeography, it's just assuming that all species are exactly the same. It assumes that any one species has the same probability of immigrating to an island and the same probability of going extinct if it gets there. But is that correct? Would we expect species to arrive at islands at the same rate? So think about this biologically. We've talked about the abiotic conditions of an island. Let's now bring biology back in and ask ourselves, would we expect species to arrive at islands with the same rate or the same probability? So just as a fake clicker question, which of these species would you expect to first colonize new islands? A small plant that is pollinated by birds. B, a large tree with small wind-dispersed seeds. C, a large flightless bird. Or D, a small finch that specializes on one food source. Just give you about 10 seconds on this. Okay. Righty, let's just go through this. So rather than me just give you the answer, I thought we'd work through the answers together. Let's get through them one at a time. So which of these species would you expect to first colonize new islands? A small plant that is pollinated by birds. Well, a small plant, after a plant has started to grow, it's pretty much stuck where it is. So the plant's size doesn't affect its dispersal. What affects a plant's dispersal is its ability to transport seeds. Seeds are where plants disperse all over the globe. So we can't really tell about that. And also, this plant is pollinated by birds. And what this means is if this plant wants to colonize a new island, the birds that pollinate that plant must already exist on the island. If the birds aren't there, the plant can never colonize. So it's pretty unlikely that a small plant pollinated by birds would be the first species to colonize new islands. Let's go on to C, a large flightless bird. Well, a large flightless bird, it can't fly, so it's not going to do very well at crossing large amounts of ocean. D, a small finch that specializes on one food source. Well, a small finch is a small flying songbird. These can actually cross areas of ocean pretty well. Birds can generally, but it specializes on one particular food source. So even if that bird arrives at a new island, if its food source isn't present, it's not going to colonize. Conversely, a large tree with small wind-dispersed seeds, how big the tree gets is not necessarily important, but it has small wind-dispersed seeds. So these seeds are able to cross large areas of ocean, and when the seed gets there, it can probably germinate and grow and get on with it. So the answer here is B. We would expect a large tree with small wind-dispersed seeds to be the first to colonize. So let's just, in this regard, just briefly revisit this filters concept that we talked about last time. So remember, the filters concept, it tells us, it describes, based on the number of species in our regional species pool, how many species do we see in our local community? So remember, from the regional species pool, this might be the species that are present on the mainland, and we're trying to get what species are on our island. Well, for a species to get to our island, first it has to be able to disperse. It has to pass through the dispersal filter. And this is the filter that weeds out species unable to reach a specific habitat, i.e. they can't fly, swim, disperse by seeds, etc. After they've made it to the island, then they have to pass through the abiotic filter. And this one weeds out arriving species unable to cope with the new environment through pH, temperature, things like that. After they've passed through the abiotic filter, then they have to pass through the biotic filter. And this filter weeds out species unable to compete or deal with predators, or species that are lacking their prey or pollinator species. So this particular concept is very applicable to the theory of island biogeography, and also very applicable to us understanding the biological components of species that are associated with their abilities to colonize. And so generally, based on this whole idea, what we'd expect to see on new islands, we would expect to see species like this. So in terms of animals, you expect to see bats and birds. Both of these species are capable of flight, and being able to fly means that they might be able to cross shortish distances of ocean under their own power, but also if you're flying and you get caught up in a storm, you can actually travel pretty spectacular distances, not entirely on purpose, but it is possible. This is why on many small islands, the only mammals that you find are actually bats. So there are no native mammals, for example, on most of the islands of New Zealand. There are, however, several bat species that exist on small islands off the coast of New Zealand. In addition, birds. We see an awful lot of birds on islands because they're able to fly and they end up getting crossed over. When we look specifically at the type of bats or birds we expect to see, we tend to find species with what we call generalist diets. This means they are species able to consume a wide variety of different food sources, which means that when they arrive on this new island, there might be something there they can already eat. Many bats are insectivorous, they eat insects, and when they do, they can generally eat a large, wide range of insects. In terms of birds, we often expect to see things like songbirds, these small finches, because they have a very wide diet breadth. They can survive off seeds, grains, and they can survive off insects and a whole range of other different types of food. In terms of plants, a lot of the time we see an awful lot of plants with wind-dispersed seeds. The seeds that you might be most familiar with for this are those of dandelions. So dandelion seeds, they make loads of them when a gust of wind hits the plant. These seeds are taken off into the air and they can travel enormous distances. Cottonwoods work in the same way. But we'd expect to see a lot of wind-dispersed plants. But one other plant group that's very highly associated with islands is palm trees and coconuts. When you think of the beautiful tropical beaches on these islands, you think of, well, coconut palms and things like that. Well, coconut palms, and in a coconut, the coconut itself is the seed. And there's no way a coconut that's about the size of a softball is getting blown about by the wind. So how do these things disperse? Well, this is what a lot of palm seeds look like. They're very large and they float. And the reason we see a lot of these palms on beaches is because this is the seed, this is the tree, and here's its seeds up here. When a seed falls, it goes bloop, and if it lands in the ocean, the seeds of most palms and coconuts float, so it can land in the ocean and it can float away, and they can survive in seawater. They're impervious to seawater, and eventually you can wash up on another island, start to grow. If it lands further up the beach, because many of these seeds are round, it falls down, rolls down into the water, and off it floats again. So as a result, all across the world, you see very similar palms on tropical beaches and tropical islands because they're able to cross these enormous distances. There also happen to be some groups of animals and plants that seem particularly good at crossing stretches of ocean. One that we might not expect are monitor lizards. So this is a Komodo dragon. It's the largest lizard in the world. It's native to a few islands in Indonesia. They're massive. They get up to about 9 foot long, and they can be really quite nasty. These things are able to cross and swim under their own power tens of kilometers of open ocean. It's not just these big monitors, smaller monitors as well. These turn up all over tropical islands. There's something about their physiology means they can just quite easily swim over the ocean. In addition, mangroves do very, very well. Mangrove trees, you see them all through the tropics and the subtropics in both the northern and southern hemisphere. These plants, they are the only trees able to grow in full seawater. No other tree is able to do that. And they have very specialized seeds. This is one here. So the seeds tend to be long, thin, sort of spear-shaped seeds. If the seed falls at low tide, when the water level would be down here, the seed sort of impales itself into the sediment and it plants itself. It sort of stabs itself down in, and the seed is buried in the sediment. If the water level is high when the seed falls, this seed also floats, it lands on the water level and it floats off and it goes and colonizes an island somewhere else. So these mangroves are very, very good at crossing large stretches of ocean. So generally, we can sort of predict the sort of species we'd expect to see on islands, things that are good at dispersal. However, there are some spectacular oddities when it comes to species on islands. So for example, these are the Galapagos Islands. They're 600 miles of open ocean between the Galapagos Islands and Ecuador. So Ecuador is the mainland continent. It's very biodiverse. You know, part of South America. It's high biodiversity, tropical rainforests, all that sort of stuff. Lots and lots of species. But it's 600 miles of open ocean between Ecuador and the Galapagos. So what sort of species would we then expect to find on these volcanic Galapagos Islands? Well, in terms of the birds, we might expect songbirds, things like finches. The finches were the inspiration for Darwin's theory of evolution, the Galapagos finch. These birds are descended from individuals on the mainland, and they're finches, they can fly, they're small, they get caught up in storms, there's a lot of them. So as a result, you'd expect a few of them eventually to end up on this island and be able to colonize. Finches also have a very diverse diet, so when they got there, there was certainly something for them to eat. In addition to the finches, you see a lot of other songbirds. These are, again, small birds, highly varied diet that can colonize very easily when they arrive. In terms of the plants, well, what would we expect to see? Well, in theory, we should see a lot of species with wind-dispersed seeds. So a lot of species that are present on the mainland can then be blown over by the wind. Their seeds can be caught on the wind currents and end up colonizing the Galapagos. And that is what you see. You see an awful lot of the plant species that are present on the Galapagos have wind-dispersed seeds, because that's probably how they got there in the first place. So generally, on the Galapagos Islands, we see the species we'd expect to see: songbirds, small birds, and wind-dispersed plants. However, how do you then explain this? So this is the other group of species that the Galapagos is incredibly famous for. It's the Galapagos giant tortoise, or one species of Galapagos giant tortoise. These things are enormous. They weigh up sort of somewhere in the region of 300 pounds. You can see how big that one is compared to the lady that's in the picture with it. And these tortoises are present on many of the islands in the Galapagos, and they were present on many other ones before they went extinct. So how on earth does a giant tortoise cross 600 miles of open ocean? These things cannot swim at all. If they end up in the water, they drown very, very quickly. So how do they cross 600 miles of open ocean? Well, let's do a fake clicker question. So how did the tortoise get to the Galapagos? A, eggs and adults were transported there by explorers. B, they arrived as marine turtles and evolved to be terrestrial. C, babies arrived on floating rafts. Or D, nobody's entirely sure. Just give you 10 seconds on this one. 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1, stop. Well, again, let's work through it. Is it A, eggs and adults were transported to the islands by explorers? Well, when the first explorers arrived on the Galapagos Islands, when the first European explorers arrived there, they found that the islands were already covered in tortoises. And there are the remains of tortoises on the islands. There's fossil bones and things like that that are much older than the human species is generally. So not only did the tortoise arrive there before explorers, the tortoise arrived there before there were explorers. So it's not A. B, they arrived as marine turtles that are able to swim and evolved to become terrestrial, which means they live on land. This was originally put forward as an idea when explorers first found these tortoises on the island. However, subsequent analysis has revealed that genetically, these species are much more closely related to land tortoises on the mainland of Ecuador than they are to any marine turtles that are alive today. Marine turtles and terrestrial tortoises split off from each other evolutionarily a very, very long time ago. And so it's pretty much absolutely untrue that they arrived as marine turtles and evolved to be terrestrial. C, babies arrived on floating rafts. This was put forward a few times because this process of new species arriving on land masses courtesy of floating rafts has been observed multiple times. It certainly gets seen a lot in small lizards on tropical islands where there's palm trees, because these small lizards live in the palm fronds. When the palm branches fall, you get the entire frond falling at once. This forms a raft. The little lizard is sitting on the raft, and that palm frond can then float over the ocean and travel long distances. This has actually been observed, especially for things like anole lizards in the Caribbean, and it even gets observed in things like iguanas in Florida and places like that. So in theory, yes, if we've observed lizards in trees sitting on palm fronds falling into the water, and then they can float over on rafts. However, there is one major problem with this, and that is tortoises don't climb trees. So if this is true, and we're talking about palm frond rafts and stuff like that, how did the baby tortoise get onto the palm raft? It certainly wasn't in the tree when the palm raft fell, so it's a little bit sketchy. So the actual answer to this is nobody is entirely sure, and this is still an active area of research. Still to this day, no one is 100% sure about how the tortoises got to the Galapagos Islands. Let's just talk about the tortoise on the Galapagos for a second. So this map here shows the islands of the Galapagos, and it also shows whether or not there are tortoises on that island today, and also whether or not there's evidence of extinct species of tortoises on other islands. So on this map, the grey islands are ones that contain tortoises today, and these are the names of those tortoises. The grey islands are ones that have them today. White islands are the ones without tortoises today. In addition, we have these white islands have a tortoise name, and they have this little crucifix next to them. What that means is there are extinct evidence of extinct races of tortoises on these islands. There's a couple of issues with giant tortoises in terms of their survival. So these islands, remember, are 600 miles into the ocean away from the mainland. When these islands were first discovered and there were tortoises seen on them, early explorers used to stop off at the islands and collect giant tortoises to have as fresh meat on their ocean journeys. Giant tortoises will stay alive without any food for a very long time, and they don't even really need that much water. And so as a result, by collecting giant tortoises, you had a way of having a stash of meat on your boat that was fresh for a long period of time. As a result, they overexploited some of these islands, and they ate all the tortoises on them, which is why places like Floriana and Fernandina no longer have tortoises on them. Okay. But we need to talk about this one island in particular. So this is Pinta and the Pinta Island giant tortoise. So this map was made in 2008, and this is critical. In 2008, it shows this island as having tortoises on it because it's labeled in grey. However, the Pinta Island tortoise, so the species that inhabits Pinta Island, is known from a single living individual. His name was Lonesome George. Because when people had first arrived on Pinta Island, they actually thought there were no tortoises on the island. When they'd explored the island, they'd found skeletons and evidence of that there was tortoises on that island once, but they didn't find any living specimens on that island until 1971, when a survey of the island came across Lonesome George. He was the last tortoise alive on this island in 1971, and he'd survived exploitation by explorers for 100 or so years, but he was the only one that was left. People were instantly kind of concerned that Lonesome George, he was the last individual of a species. So there was a big conservation effort made, and efforts were made to actually mate George to closely related species of tortoises from other islands. So for example, they tried to mate him with the Vulcan wolf giant tortoise, the Espanola giant tortoise, and the San Cristobal giant tortoise. Because George was a male, they put him with females of these other species in the hope that he would actually breed. The idea would be that although the offsprings produced would be hybrids, some of George's genes would actually survive. Now, although this process led to eggs being produced, unfortunately, none of them hatched. And Lonesome George himself actually died in June of 2012. As he was the last member of his entire species, his death meant that his species is also now extinct. To this day, there is no such species alive as the Pinta Island giant tortoise. What this means is that it was 4, but it's now 5 of the 15 species of giant tortoise that have ever existed are now extinct. In terms of this map, this little island should also now be white. It's kind of a sad story, and it shows you the fragility of some of these species on these small charismatic islands. Okay, that is as far as I wanted to get to today. I hope you enjoyed the lecture on island biodiversity. Remember, there is a specific assignment dedicated purely to this concept. It's available on Canvas, and I will see you next time.